All right. Thank you, everybody, and welcome back. So a couple of housekeeping notes. After the keynote, we're going to take a few questions at the end of the keynote, but the main discussion will happen in a breakout session at 1 o'clock this afternoon. So if you have questions, we aren't able to get to it during the regular keynote address portion. We will try to get to all of those during the breakout session this afternoon. As we go through the keynote too, if you double click on the slides, it should expand and go full screen. So I guess we started planning this year's summit in early March as an in-person event, and then the world changed on us. But I think to a certain extent, the delay that caused was fortuitous, and it gave us a little bit more time to find our keynote speaker. Our plan had always been to focus our summit this year on the integration of equity into our sustainability work, but it was critical that we find the right keynote speaker to do this. Earlier this summer, several from the Office of Sustainability were on an Eco Districts webinar where Dr. Julian Agyeman was the presenter. As he spoke, I was blown away by the insight and the vision that he brought forward on this topic. As soon as the session ended, all of us from the office who were on there kind of got on a group text message and said, we really need to bring Dr. Agyeman in as the keynote speaker. So without kind of too much further ado, Dr. Agyeman is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He's the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He centers his research on critical explorations of the complex and embedded relations between humans and the urban environment, whether mediated by governments or social movement organizations, and their effects on public policy and planning processes and outcomes, particularly in relation to notions of justice and equity. He believes that what our cities can become and who is allowed to belong in them are fundamentally and inextricably linked. He's the author of or editor of 12 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, and Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities. In 2018, he was awarded the Athenia City Accolade by the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Julian Agyeman.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Kristen, for inviting me, and hello, Cleveland. I wish I could be there in person, but as Jason said, we live in a different world mediated now by technology, and thankfully we do have pretty good technologies to enable us to communicate with each other. What I want to do over the next 40 minutes or so really is to give you a lot of ideas, ideas that will challenge you, frankly, challenge you to really question some of your deeply held beliefs. And that's good. That's what we need. We need a big reset, a big rethink. And I think what I'm going to help you do is to start that process. Some of you are further along in that process. But let me start by doing one thing, and that is something that is very important to me. And unfortunately, because of technology, I'm going to have to request next slide. So it might break up my presentation a little bit, but Kristen, next slide, please. So one thing that's become increasingly obvious to me is that we need to recognize in the United States, as they do in Canada, Australia, and in New Zealand, other settler colonial nations, that this land is their land. This land isn't our land. We are inhabitants on this land, and we need to recognize at each conference, at each gathering, that we're on other people's land. And I'm presenting to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, from the territory, the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people. And I want to pay my respects to their elders, to their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. And for those of you who don't know, it was 400 years ago last month that the Mayflower arrived from Britain onto the shores of Massachusetts, and the settler colonial project began with contact with the Wampanoag people. Next slide, please. So let me give you a little bit of background to this concept of just sustainabilities. When I started thinking about sustainability in the early 90s, it really was a concept that was about the environment. And if we were to go out onto the streets of Cleveland and ask people, what is sustainability? For those who ever thought about it, most 9, 10 would say, oh, it's about the environment. And of course it is about the environment, but it's about so much more than just the environment. I could see us legislating, regulating for a green world, a green planet. But if that planet wasn't also socially just, would it really be sustainable? And so this book in the early 2000s really embarked on exploding what I called the equity deficit, the deficit in equity and justice-based thinking around this project of sustainable development. And let me just say, for those of you who are thinking, oh, sustainability, fly-by-night concept, it's a trendy concept. It came out in 1980 in the World Conservation Strategy. It's a concept that has been around for 40 years, and we are still arguing over what it means, how to implement it. It is not a fly-by-night concept. Sustainability is a robust organizing concept for urban planning, for conservation planning, environmental planning, for organizing our society. Resilience, issues like that fit very well into the wider concept of sustainability. So this book, Just Sustainability's Development in an Unequal World, really looked at the links between environmental quality and human equality. Let's just think about some of the social movements. If you think about environmental quality, you're thinking Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, National Audubon Society. And then when you think about human equality, you're thinking Amnesty International, all the social justice groups. Are they speaking to each other? Certainly in the early 2000s they weren't. And I would argue that we've failed on environmental protection and social justice because we've seen them as separate issues. And I was very heartened recently when I was asked to do the sleeve notes of a book, a social work book, but the links between social work and environmental justice. If you think about social workers, what communities are they primarily working in? They're working in distressed communities, communities who are living in environmental justice neighborhoods. There are inextricable links between environmental quality and human equality, as I'm going to show throughout my presentation. So in this book, we argue that sustainability is not to be a green or environmental concern, important green aspects of sustainability are. We argued that a truly sustainable society is one where wider questions of social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to the environmental limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. Next slide, please. Now, as an academic, I don't usually advertise other people's books, but if there's a book that I think you should read, it is this one. It's by a couple of British academics called The Spirit Level: Why Equality is Better for Everyone. The headline in this is that they took 40 years of data from across the world, across cultures, across political regimes. And here's what they found. It's not poverty. Poverty's bad, but that's not what's killing us. Inequality is what's killing us, literally all of us. It is compromising our well-being. It's compromising our lives in multiple ways. The rich are putting themselves in gated communities. The poor are left to fare for themselves, especially in a country with less safety nets like the United States. So inequality, they argued in this book, based on hard data, inequality, the greater the gap between rich and poor, the more social problems. So countries with the biggest gap between rich and poor, like the United States, have the highest prison populations, have high homicide rates, have high teen pregnancy rates, have high related health problems, have high underachievement rates in schools. On every social factor, inequality was correlated very strongly. But what they also found that was really interesting to me was that basically in countries with the greatest gap between rich and poor, the advertising revenues were biggest. Advertisers love inequality because inequality sells. The poor are trying to buy themselves into the next category, the middle class into the upper middle class, the rich into the super rich. We are on, in unequal nations, an escalator of consumption. And in yellow, I highlighted a quote: inequality heightens competitive consumption. keeping up with the Joneses. The more unequal our societies, the more we desperately try to keep up by buying stuff. Buying stuff, competitive consumption, increases our carbon footprint. So get this, climate change, carbon production is greater in more unequal societies. How often do you hear the climate change lobby talking about that? They're always talking about sustainable agriculture, the need for sustainable transportation, greenhouses. Yes, absolutely. But those are some of the ways we can ameliorate climate change. But if we really want to understand climate change and do something about it, we have to look to inequality as one of the main drivers of climate change. So if we really want to understand sustainability, we should focus on both human equality and environmental equality together, not separately. Next slide. So how do we define just sustainabilities? The need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And there are 4 imperatives: improving our quality of life and well-being, meeting the needs of both present and future generations. We need to think about justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. Let me just dwell on this. This concept of recognition is very important. At the moment, we have the biggest cry for recognition in hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Me Too, other movements for indigenous rights. These are cries for recognition. These are cries of people saying, I exist, I have a right to exist. And I would argue that we cannot do justice and equity by anybody until we recognize the rights to exist of these groups who are at the moment demanding recognition. We can have no reconciliation without recognition of these people's rights. And that's why I do a land recognition statement. Until we recognize where we are in the United States, on whose people's land, we need to be honest about that, and we need to understand that reconciliation can only come through recognition. And finally, and equally importantly, we need to live within ecosystem limits. We need to live on this one planet. There is no planet B, there is no pipeline to another planet bringing resources and taking away wastes, period. Next slide, please. Now, I want to just, because I'm in urban planning, I want to give you 2 overarching thoughts on urban planning, and you can think about these in relation to Cleveland. Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. How are you doing that in Cleveland? How are you managing the coexistence of all the people in your city in the shared space called Cleveland? It's crucial that we do this as urban planners. And whether we're talking about environmental issues, transport, housing, any other land use or social conflicts, we have to think that we're not all the same. We are very different. Our cities are increasingly diverse and different, and that we need to find ways of coexisting in these city spaces, from next door neighbors to the street, to the neighborhood, the city, and the region. That's a challenge, but it's a challenge that we're already on the path of. And if we see it as an opportunity as well to bring in and to celebrate this coexistence, this difference, this diversity, I think then we're on a good track. And as Jason mentioned at the beginning, I'm interested also in this relationship between belonging and becoming. Look, I'm in urban planning. You people are thinking about sustainability. We're always thinking about what our cities can become: smart, sustainable, resilient, sharing, all of those great things. Let's not stop dreaming. Let's not stop the vision. But we have to realize that we're increasingly denying belonging through recognition, reconciliation, difference, diversity, and inclusion. We're excluding people. And our cities can only become what they can truly become if we can guarantee belonging to the residents of our cities. I also want to point out as well, in urban planning, there's a big thing about human-scaled planning. I want to add an E to human. I want humane scaled planning. And I think my concept of just sustainabilities helps us think through all of these ideas: coexistence, shared space, belonging, becoming, humane scaled planning. Next slide, please. So I want to give 3 examples in the rest of my time. And these are the example of what I call spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? Second example, very topical, Minneapolis. How does one of the most green liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? And then finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about food justice. What is local food in intercultural societies? Next slide. So here's an example of a city, Jerusalem, which is very spatially unjust. On one side of the wall, they live, and on the other side, you live. And as David Lammy, the British MP, profoundly reminded us way back in 2004, just as social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class lines, spatial justice requires that they are not distributed geographically. We have one of the most powerful tools that geography has ever given to us since the map, Geographic Information Systems, GIS, which really are maps of spatial injustice. Now, we don't have a wall in US cities generally. I mean, I'm sure there's not a wall in Cleveland. There isn't a wall here in Boston or Cambridge. But there are creeks, there are railway lines, there are freeways, and on one side they live, and on the other side you live, and their life chances are not as good as your life chances. You get the picture. We have markers in our urban environments that are markers of spatial injustice. Just down the road from me is Brookline, one of the most wealthy settlements in the Boston metro area. And then just across the river is Roxbury, one of the poorest. Spatial injustice in our cities today. Next slide, please. And what I'm going to do now is bring this concept to ground. I'm going to think about the street. The street is the most common public space that we use every day. Every day we interact with each other on streets. And here we have two streets, exactly the same width, but they couldn't be more spatially differentiated in terms of their organization. On the left, we have Södervägen in Gothenburg in Sweden. And on the right, we have Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, near where I live. As I say, both streets are identical width. On the left, you see the Swedish street. The Swedes have imposed spatial justice on the street. The allocation of rights is very demarcated. They have democratized the street via streetcars, via very cleanly demarcated walking spaces and cycle spaces. To the left of the streetcar is the only part of the street where private vehicles are allowed. On the right, Massachusetts Avenue, we have basically organized chaos where your right to space is predicated on A, having a vehicle, and B, the size of that vehicle. What is it like for a kid growing up on those streets? How are they wired differently when the kid comes out in Sweden and walks on the street and sees spatial justice, sees democratization, and the kid on Mass Avenue wonders, how am I going to get across that road? Who's going to stop for me? Next slide, please. We do have data on this. We know that car traffic decreases social interaction, so that on the left-hand street, you have heavily trafficked, and on the right, lightly trafficked. And you'll notice on the lightly trafficked street, there is far more social interaction. People interact more when cars are less and they are moving more slowly. And this is one of the principles behind Vision Zero. On the left-hand street, you have much less social interaction on the heavy streets. So what's the just sustainabilities take here? Who lives in lightly trafficked neighborhoods and who lives in heavily trafficked neighborhoods? Who has trucks going down their streets, which are a real threat to cyclists, and who doesn't have trucks? Who has complete streets and who has completely messy streets? These are some of the things I think we need to think about. We need to think about these streets as spatially unjust. On the lightly trafficked street in the wealthy neighborhood, there is much more interaction than on the heavily trafficked street in the lower income neighborhood. Next slide, please. We can do it, USA. We can do it. There's good news. New York, for those of you who visited in the last 10, 15 years, the Bloomberg administration embarked on a very ambitious project to pedestrianize and make a people street out of Broadway. And I want you also, when you look at this, to think of this very simple point. The Bloomberg administration, Janet Sadiq Khan as the transportation commissioner, they didn't think about, oh, well, we can't do this. They did it. They did what is possible, not what is probable. If we keep planning, thinking about sustainability and issues like sustainability and planning in terms of, well, we can't do that. No, we have to have leaders with vision who say, yes, it is possible to do that, because there's good news from New York and there's good news all around the country, especially as a result of COVID, where people have seen open spaces and value open spaces, where they've seen streets without so many cars, and they've seen streets with increasing numbers of cycle routes. How do we maintain that after the current COVID crisis? That's going to be a key issue. Next slide, please. But on the other hand, we are really good at telling people they don't belong here. We're good at telling skateboarders on the top left picture. We're good at telling young skateboarders, don't skate on this ledge, so we're going to put studs to stop you. We're good at telling homeless people, don't sleep on these benches because we've put armrests to stop you. Even more egregious, we put bolts, like we put those pins to stop pigeons landing on ledges on urban buildings. We put bolts, studs to stop homeless people sleeping. These are horrific, inhumane, hostile and defensive architectural techniques. We also build buildings with rich doors and poor doors, so that some of these buildings, have actual doors around the back where the lower income people who are in the subsidized housing in some of these towers, they go in the poor doors and the rich come in valet park and then go on the escalators up to their penthouse apartments. These are all ways that we tell people you don't belong in the city. And perhaps most egregious of all, on the bottom left is a bridge in Seattle where there was a homeless issue. And so the city put bike racks there, sustainability infrastructure used to deter homeless people. Thankfully, the good cyclists of Seattle said, whoa, do not use our cycle infrastructure to deter homeless people. We have a problem with homelessness. Let's deal with it in a humane and policy-oriented way. Next slide, please. Now, one of the ways that we can overcome spatial injustice is to try and give everybody complete streets. Cleveland, you probably have. I'm sure you have a complete streets policy, and we do in Massachusetts, they do in Toronto, all over North America. These complete streets policies are trying to decenter streets as conduits for cars and open up streets for cyclists, for walkers, streets for people to sit and chat. Social streets, the social ecology of streets. Next slide, please. So what is a complete street? And moreover, who gets to decide what a complete street is? Is it some urban designer's dream, or should it be more what the community wants? And on the right, we have an urban designer's dream. On the left, we have what a community wants, and that's a street in Athens. No amount of design is going to design the street on the left, because the point made by the quote here by Doreen Massey is that streets are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Yet try telling that to an urban designer who's designing complete streets. They have these cookie cutter design manuals and they say, right, here, put that in that street. But we want to understand streets as a social ecology. We do need good design for streets, but we also making the street a social ecological feature. Next slide, please. Would you believe it? Los Angeles, the car metropolis of the United States, one of the car metropolises, has a complete streets policy, but it also, until recently, had a policy banning street vending. Now let's just recollect here, this huge multicultural metropolis with a huge Latinx and South Asian population whose culture is predicated around street food, they were banned from doing that. How can we have complete streets if we ban two cultures, Latinx and Southeast Asian, from participating in one of their main cultural proclivities? Recently, the city of Los Angeles, thankfully, legalized street vending, but largely to protect street vendors from ICE enforcement, because ICE officers knew that, hey, this is illegal. It's likely that a lot of the people selling on the streets are going to be undocumented. So LA decided to protect people by legalizing it so you can get a permit to do it now. But again, this just illustrates this. Who are complete streets for? Who gets to decide what a complete street is? How can we impose spatial justice through community power? Next slide. One of the books of mine is called Incomplete Streets. Again, I'm arguing not against complete streets, but who gets to decide what a complete street is? Because in LA, we had incomplete streets because we didn't allow those cultural groups to participate in their cultural celebrations of street food. And one of the worries, though, that I have is that complete streets, as they're constructed in the US, are leading to greater gentrification and what's called greenlining. So we had redlining in the past, which was explicitly racist and denied money to certain neighborhoods based on racial characteristics. Greenlining is not racist. It's socioeconomically determined. It costs money to live in these green neighborhoods. I want green neighborhoods for everybody. But at the moment, you pay higher rents, you pay higher house prices to buy into these quiet streets. And so in many ways, what's happening is the complete streets revolution, if you think about it, is systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial, and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized US cities for the last century or more. Next slide, please. And I just want to dwell here for a moment. The key urban metric for sustainable neighborhoods is called walkability. How walkable is your neighborhood? Walkability is very, very important. And of course, as with everything in our society today, there is an app for that. And it's called Walk Score. It goes from 0 to 100. The closer to 100, the better your neighborhood is for walking. And Walk Score sells. Realtors are using Walk Score to show how quiet and nice the neighborhood is. Who owns the app for Walk Score? Well, there's a little clue with the black arrow there. It's owned by Redfin, the realty company. So let's just take stock here of this moment. The key urban metric for sustainability is walkability, and the app for that is owned by a realty company. We've compromised sustainability, urban sustainability. We have commodified urban sustainability. The question for us as urban planners is, how do we decouple sustainable green neighborhoods from money, basically? How do we give everybody a sustainable green neighborhood, irrespective of ability to pay? Next slide, please. My second case is Minneapolis. I'm fascinated by this city. Like Portland, Oregon, both on the surface very green, very progressive cities, very liberal cities. Minneapolis, for the last 10 years, the Trust for Public Land has given it the top status for urban parks. It's the best city for urban parks. It's one of the best cities for exercise. It's got the third most commuter bike mileage. It's the miracle of Minneapolis, high quality of life. It's a brilliant, brilliant place to live if you're white. Next slide, please. Because under the surface in Minneapolis, it's a racist hell. It's got the worst racial inequality, save for Milwaukee. It's got the highest black-white income gap. It's got the second highest black-white wealth gap or home ownership gap. Its K through 12 opportunity or achievement gap is some of the highest, and its indigenous white gap is some of the highest. So This illustrates my point about just sustainabilities. On the one hand, if we were to look at the surface of Portland and Minneapolis, we would think, wow, green cities. But underneath is injustice, unsustainability. This is why we need to look at social justice and equity as part of green cities. Next slide, please. So Minneapolis, why? Why is it like this? It's got a very progressive city council. I've met Jacob Fry, the mayor. He's a 37, 38-year-old guy. Great activist city council. Why is Minneapolis like this? Well, again, my profession, urban planning, has a lot to play. So if we look at, for instance, a quote here from Kirsten Delegard, a Minneapolis historian and founder of the Mapping Prejudice Project, she says, all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of great urban planning obscures some darker truths about the city. So what are those darker truths? Well, before the 1900s, Minneapolis was really quite an integrated city. It had a small but very integrated African-American population. Then people learned about segregation, racialized covenants from the early 1900s to the 1960s. And these covenants said things like, this house shall not be rented or sold to anybody other than people of the Caucasian race, no Mongoloid, Negroid, Oriental, horrible, horrific language that we wouldn't use today. So we had racialized covenants. Then we also had exclusionary and single family zoning. But before that, and it was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1917, we had explicitly racialized zoning where black and other people could not live. That was struck down in 1917. So the cities then said, well, okay, let's do racism by the back door. Let's do single family zoning. And 70% of residential land in Minneapolis was zoned for single families. And then to cap it all off, we had redlining. What was the result? Racial segregation then and now. Only one country in the world has done it better than us, folks, and that's South Africa. And they legislated nationally for separate zones of cities, passed laws, etc. We know how that ended. So what can be done? Next slide. What now? I mean, Heather Worthington is the former director of long-range planning. She said there's a direct link between those practices in the late 19th and early 20th century and today's modern zoning plans. Part of the impetus for change is to try and undo some of those impacts. I put it another way in one of the pieces that I wrote. I said urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it, as Portland and Minneapolis and many other cities are now trying to do. But this is a long-term project, as you know. Next slide, please. So the Minneapolis 2040 plan is, I think, very progressive. It's ambitious, but it needs to be. And in 2018, Minneapolis was the first large US city to vote to end single-family zoning. And now you can build duplexes, triplexes on these former single-family lots. And this is among a package of reforms, including inclusionary zoning reforms, which require new apartment projects to include at least 10% of units for moderate to low-income housing. And, you know, number one goal of this plan is to eliminate disparities and, quote, Minneapolis will see all communities fully thrive regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, or zip code, having eliminated deep-rooted disparities in wealth, opportunity, housing, safety, and health. Ambitious goal, but we need ambitious goals. Next slide, please. So my final set of thoughts is on food justice. And on the next slide, I want to ask the question that I asked you back at the beginning. What are local foods in intercultural societies? And I have a picture here of George and Julia Bowling of the Bowling Farm in Maryland. And they are there in one of their processing rooms, They were tobacco farmers, but for a couple of decades now, the state of Maryland has been offering incentives to get farmers out of tobacco. And so George and Julia started scratching their heads thinking, what are we going to do? And being good American entrepreneurs, they realized that in the DC Metroplex, there are about 120,000 Africans, many of whom are middle and upper middle class, lawyers, judges, doctors, professors, diplomats, and they want to eat African food, but they don't want African food flown in. They want to eat it locally. So George and Julia, with the University of Maryland Extension Service and with the African community in DC, decided to try and find out what will grow in Maryland. And there's now a booklet about African crops that can be grown in Maryland. It includes recipes. It's a great intercultural learning resource for people, African and non-African, who want to try local foods. So again, what are local foods in intercultural societies? If the Africans want to eat African food, next slide, please. If the Filipinos in San Diego want to eat Filipino food, and when interviewed and asked about what local food is, they said, well, it's our food. It's the food we grow in our yards. It's the food we grow, the food we eat in our restaurants. So in the title here, I've put Food Justice, Trans-Local Identities. Here's the deal. I'm a geographer. There is no such thing as local. Local is what I can convince you is local, or we can agree what is local. Is local a geographic concept, or is it a cultural concept? These immigrants seem to think it's a cultural concept. They bring with them their own local, hence this idea of trans-local identities. The immigrant communities in Cleveland bring with them the belongings of their culture, and they bring it to their new life in this country. And we should be proud of that, because we get great restaurants, we get great food, we get great cultural celebrations as a result of that. Trans-local identities. Let's broaden our thinking about what local is. And it's not what the alternative food crowd, the Michael Pollan food crowd say is local and straitjacketed as local. It's what people believe it is, and especially what our cultural minorities want to call local. Next slide, please. We can even go further afield to Metro Vancouver in Canada. Get this, nearly 20% of farmers in the Greater Vancouver region in Canada are Chinese Canadians. And due to a history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, the Canadians deny that they're racist, but they are. Due to a history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada, along with this entrepreneurial spirit of these Chinese Canadian farmers, they don't use the established farmers markets. They've set up their own network of roadside farmers markets. So they're parallel, they run parallel to the largely white middle class farmers markets that were already established. And I gave this talk in Vancouver a few years ago, and an East African woman said, Julian, quick question. I go to the Chinese farmers markets because you know what? They sell the crops that I want to buy. They sell the food that I want to buy. So Chinese entrepreneurialism here is catering not just to Chinese people, but to other minorities, because the Chinese have seen a gap in the market for feeding their desires, their cultural desires. Next slide, please. This always gives me a chill down my spine when I think about this. This picture is from Los Angeles, from South Central Farm, LA, the now defunct, the largest urban farm. 95% of the farmers were Latinx people. And those two women gave a quote, and they said, we planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that we had back in our garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home, and this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. Beautiful. They want to be Americans, but they want a little bit of sanctuary, a little bit of space. And this idea of autotopography means inscribing one's community and culture onto the landscape. And so there's not only culturally appropriate crops there in their in their little garden, but they are arranged in the way that they were arranged in their garden in Oaxaca. We all need some sanctuary. We all need a space that we can call our own. Next slide, please. There are 50 farms throughout the United States. Tufts University, my university, is a partner in one in Lowell, Massachusetts, called New Entry Farms. And these 50 farms across the US are for starter farmers, refugees, immigrants from other countries, Eastern Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, all around the world. And they come to learn about farming in the US, but not just to learn about farming, but to bring their own farming traditions with them. And so these places, and this picture here is New Roots Farm in San Diego. These are spaces where traditional US methods and modern immigrant methods collide and create what I call the new agriculture. This is the new agriculture for a new century in the United States. Next slide, please. I just want to give a plug to my latest book. This is called The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labor and Identity in North America. And it's a book really that looks at food at the macro scale. And I don't know whether President Trump knows this, but if we did kick out all the undocumented workers, food prices would go through the roof, because 70% of people working in the food chain from the fields to restaurants are undocumented. Now, that's not a good reason to keep undocumented workers, but it gives us an opening. His belligerence as regards undocumented people gives us an opening to think about how integrated and integrally related food and immigration are. So the book really starts by looking at the big macro picture, relating immigration policy and food policy. But then the second part of the book really looks at the daily lives of immigrants and food provisioning, and how they increasingly rely on the foodways, the traditions of their food in an increasingly xenophobic United States. So the book, I think, will be of interest to anybody who's interested in almost like the anthropology and the policy aspects of food. Next slide. So in summary, let me just recap some key points. We need to think in terms of urban planning, in terms of urban sustainability, about how do we manage our coexistence in shared space. We need to think about who gets to belong in our cities, because I'm hoping you're convinced now, our cities can only become as good as who gets to belong. If we keep pushing out the poor, if we gentrify our cities such that people are displaced into suburban areas, who will be left to decide what the city becomes? It will be elites, and we will have elite spaces as our cities. We need to foster engagement and belonging using a deep ethnographic understanding of communities. We don't just want demographics, we want ethnographics. Demographics give us statistics, 79% Latino, 12% African American. We want deep ethnographies to understand who these communities are. What are their desires? What are their strengths? What do they want to achieve? We need to engage in intercultural, culturally competent planning and policy making. We need to practice humane-scaled and human-scaled urban planning and design. And above all, I want to leave you with this point, and we can go after 1 o'clock to talk more about it. Social justice never simply happens. Show me a policy that was technically, environmentally, and economically perfect that delivered social justice as well. There are no policies like that. We have to start with social justice and equity, and we will then move towards social justice and equity. Social justice and equity must be implicit, front and center, and intentional in our work. Thank you. Next slide. I can take some questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Agyeman. That was a great speech. We've got a ton of really good questions in the chat.
Let's just take one or two, Jason, and save the rest. We've got an hour after 1 o'clock. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think maybe I can ask one that's a bit of a summary and amalgam of a couple of them. So you really, at the start of this, talked about inequality as a main driver of climate change. I think we had a couple of folks who were really interested in, are there specific policies and practices? And I know that's a broad question with a lot of potential paths to go down. Are there specific policies or practices that for the larger group of folks we have here today that you would recommend or say we think about, maybe not the specific solutions, but what are some of those things we should be thinking about and focused on?
Well, so here's the mismatch. Number one, most people who are involved in climate action are not thinking about inequality. They're thinking about some of the symptoms, some of the ways that we can ameliorate climate change impacts, like sustainable agriculture, like a whole range of adaptation techniques, like sustainable transportation, green housing, etc., etc. So it's mainly the climate change people that are thinking about that. I think we need a broader constituency, bringing in those people working on social policy issues like affordable housing, like greening affordable housing, all the good social policies that we know about making public transit more affordable and more accessible and cheaper. So in many ways, we're doing a lot of the right things. We're just not embedding them deeply enough. And, one of the threats that COVID has shown us is, the future of public transit. What is the future of public transit? We need good public transit. It's been shown that for low-income people especially, good public transit systems lead to better job opportunities, more housing opportunities, etc. So, to pull out specific policies is difficult. But what we really need is integrated policy making and planning. And I think if we start to think big picture, Green New Deal big picture, then we're going to hit a lot of these inequality issues and their knock-on effects in terms of climate change and wider issues of environmental degradation. So we need bold, visionary policy making. We need to de-silo policy making, and we need to really embed the idea that it's not about climate change, it's about climate justice or climate inequality. And we're already seeing this. Let me give you an example. In East Boston, which is a largely immigrant Latin American community by Logan International Airport in Boston, they're already building new condos for the wealthy. And these condos are being built at certain heights above sea level. They've got all the environmental protections. And Boston City Council is helping the developers do this. Now, that's great, but research from my colleagues has shown that these improved residences for the wealthy might make East Boston even more vulnerable for those who cannot afford these residences. So in doing something good, like climate mitigation and climate adaptation, we might be worsening the problem for those who cannot afford it. So again, it's a great question, Jason, but it's not a simple one that we can answer just in one policy prescription, because there's no silver bullets here. It's about integrated policy making.
Well, I think we might have time for one last question, and I'll go with a little bit of recency bias since it just popped up in the chat here. This is from Natalie Elwell, and I apologize, Natalie, if I mispronounced your name, but she works for a climate research group with a large program focused on cities. Most of my colleagues on both the climate side and the urban planning side have not had any introduction to equity and justice in their university programs. It is now my job to bring this perspective to their work. Why is this not taught in urban planning programs?
If there was one question I would ask you to ask me, it would be this one, Jason. You just keep on asking me the right questions, okay? That's what I want. No, hey, listen, at Tufts, we are number one program in accredited program at the Masters. Why are we great? Because we see urban planning as the interplay between social justice and sustainability. There's 80 accredited planning programs throughout the country, and they're all good, but none of them have such an intentional and explicit focus on social justice and sustainability. So Natalie, yes, no wonder you didn't get any of this, because most programs are only just beginning. And what's really interesting, they're only just beginning to think in this way. What's really interesting, so I teach a class based on this called Just Sustainabilities in Policy and Planning. I started it 20 years ago, and my students, they enjoyed the class, but I've had emails from them from 20 years ago. They say, Julian, we now understand what that class was about. Now, the what is hitting the fan. We know what that class is about. Students have to demand that these classes exist, these classes on the interplay of social justice and equity. And I'm just going to close by saying that some time ago, I had a sabbatical, and I was at McGill University in Montreal. And some of the students came to my class and they were saying, we've never heard urban planning talked of in these terms. And one said, I'm in an urban planning class with another professor. They didn't give me the name, quite rightly. And in the first class, one of the students said, when are we going to get to equity and social justice? And the professor said, oh, equity and social justice, we'll get to that. And this is going to be the title of my next book, because so many people say, oh, we'll get to that. It's still seen as a second order priority. Environmental, economic, the technical policy design and planning design issues are seen as priority. And if we can increase social justice and equity, then maybe we'll do that. But as I said in my last slide, social justice and equity never simply happen. They need to be front and center in our policy making. Otherwise, they will not happen. We will not increase equity and social justice in communities unless these are conspicuously, mindfully inserted at the beginning of policy discussions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Julie. This was a fabulous keynote address. I know we've got a lot more questions coming in. We're going to take a little break here, and then the first breakout session started at 12:45. The larger discussion with Dr. Agyeman will start at 1 o'clock. So we'll try to answer as many of your questions as possible during that breakout. Kristen, anything to add before we break for lunch here?
I just want to thank you again, Dr. Agyeman. This was awesome. I feel honored to have been your slide turner for this presentation. And I think what's really tough in this virtual environment is we can't give you a round of applause, but I just want to give you a big round of applause from Cleveland. Thank you very much for sharing this.
Kristen, if you ever need a job, just, you can be my slide turner, okay?
Okay, great. Sorry, Jason, I've got bad news for you.
Well, I think we're going to hang on to Kristen a little longer. So.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you back
at 1 o'clock.
Yep. And everyone else, please enjoy a great lunch. Please continue to use the networking features to get to know one another. It seems like some of you have already started some of that. So it's very exciting for me that we can still maintain some of our summit bread and butter, even though we are not in the same room as each other. So looking forward to seeing you all this afternoon and throughout the rest of the 2 days here, and enjoy your lunch.